From tiny post-war runabouts to hulking SUVs and modern compacts, some American cars earned a deadly reputation, not just for crash stats, but for the ways their designs failed in the real world. This countdown spotlights the designs and defects that turn survivable crashes into tragedies. Exposed fuel tanks, rollover-prone geometry, weak structures, and critical part failures. Number 25. 1949 Crosley Hotshot. In the late 1940s, America was still adjusting to a peacetime economy, and Crosley Motors tried to capture post-war buyers with something small, sporty, and affordable. The result was the Crosley Hotshot, a two-door roadster that weighed barely 1,100 pounds and looked like a scaled-down sports car for the masses. On paper, it was a clever idea, nimble, easy to park, and priced far below the big Detroit Iron dominating the roads. The trouble was, the Hotshot's engineering was more suited to a fairground novelty than a daily driver. Its tiny 44 cubic inch four-cylinder engine featured tin-welded sheet metal block construction, which was prone to warping, cracking, and catastrophic failure if cooling was less than perfect. In many cases, owners discovered their Hotshot's heart had failed with little warning, leaving them stranded, sometimes in dangerous situations on busy highways where the underpowered car was already struggling to keep up with traffic. In crashes, the Hotshot offered virtually no occupant protection. There were no crumple zones, no reinforced doors, no seat belts, not even much structural rigidity to speak of. The thin body panels and lightweight frame could fold like paper in even a moderate collision, leaving driver and passenger dangerously exposed. The low weight and short wheelbase also meant that sudden maneuvers, like swerving to avoid an obstacle, could unsettle the car completely. In wet weather, the narrow bias ply tires had minimal grip, and braking distances were alarmingly long. What made the Crosley Hotshot truly deadly was the combination of these factors with its speed-capable image. While it could barely reach 70 miles per hour, its lack of stability and structural safety meant that a crash at half that speed could still be fatal. Period accident reports often noted severe injuries from impacts that a heavier, better-built car might have absorbed. In the pre-seatbelt era, ejections were common, and the open-top body offered no rollover protection whatsoever. Today, the Crosley Hotshot is remembered fondly by some collectors for its quirky charm, but among safety historians, it stands as an early example of how lightweight, under-engineered vehicles could turn ordinary driving hazards into deadly encounters. It might have been marketed as a fun, economical runabout, but in reality, the Hotshot's flimsy construction and mechanical fragility made it one of the most dangerous American-built cars of its time. Number 24. 1954 Nash Metropolitan. When Nash introduced the Metropolitan in the mid-1950s, it was a curious anomaly in the American car market. 5. At a time when Detroit's offerings were getting longer, lower, and heavier, the Metropolitan was tiny, built in England, and styled to appeal to cost-conscious drivers who didn't need a full-size car. It was marketed as a second car for suburban households, perfect, according to ads, for the lady of the house to run errands while her husband drove the big sedan to work. Its size and weight, just 1,785 pounds, might have been an advantage for fuel economy, but in terms of safety, it was a liability. The Metropolitan rode on a very narrow track and had a short wheelbase, which made it light and nimble on paper, but prone to instability in real-world driving. Drivers noted that sharp turns could induce dramatic body roll, and in emergency maneuvers, the little Nash was worryingly easy to unsettle. In wet conditions, its skinny bias ply tires could lose traction without much warning. The construction did nothing to inspire confidence. Like most cars of its era, it had no seat belts, no crumple zones, and no reinforced passenger cell. In a collision, the steering column was a solid spear aimed directly at the driver's chest. The low mass meant that in any encounter with a larger car, and virtually everything else on the road in the 1950s and early 60s was larger, the Metropolitan would take the brunt of the impact, transferring forces directly to its occupants. Even low-speed crashes could cause severe injuries. Accident reports from the period often read like cautionary tales. A sideswipe from a full-size sedan could spin the Metropolitan around completely, and a direct hit could crush it like a tin can. Because of its small dimensions, other drivers sometimes failed to see it in traffic until it was too late, leading to rear-end and intersection collisions. Today, collectors appreciate the Metropolitan for its charm and quirkiness, but its reputation among safety experts remains grim. It serves as an example of how the push for economy and compactness in a land of massive automobiles created a dangerous mismatch on American roads. The Nash Metropolitan was undeniably cute, but when style and thrift took priority over protection, it became one of the deadliest small cars ever to wear an American badge. Number 23. 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air. The 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air stands as a perfect snapshot of late 50s American automotive excess: dramatic tail fins, wide chrome grilles, and an X-frame chassis designed more for style and low stance than for structural integrity. At a time when safety engineering was still in its infancy, Chevrolet prioritized sleek, futuristic lines over the ability to protect its occupants in a serious collision. Seatbelts were optional, the steering column was a rigid spear aimed straight at the driver's chest, and there was virtually no side impact reinforcement in the doors. The most infamous strike against the '59 Bel Air came decades later, when the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety staged a head-on crash test between it and a 2009 Chevrolet Malibu. The results were shocking. The Bel Air's front end crumpled almost instantly, the A-pillars folded, and the steering wheel shot violently toward the driver's position. In that test, the modern car's occupant would have walked away, while anyone inside the Bel Air would likely have suffered fatal injuries. This vividly demonstrated just how little crash protection cars from that era offered. The X-frame design, introduced by General Motors in the late 1950s, was especially dangerous in side impacts. Without traditional perimeter frame rails, there was minimal structural resistance to intrusion from another vehicle, meaning a T-bone collision could push deep into the passenger cabin. The heavy body-on-frame construction did nothing to absorb crash energy. Instead, that force was transmitted directly to the occupants. Braking performance was also a concern. The Bel Air relied on drum brakes all around, which faded quickly under repeated stops and performed poorly in wet conditions. Combined with its large size and relatively soft suspension, the car could be difficult to control in an emergency maneuver. While the '59 Bel Air remains a beloved classic at car shows, its reputation among safety experts is far less glamorous. It represents an era when automotive styling trumped occupant protection and when survivability in a crash was often a matter of luck. For all its beauty and historical charm, the Bel Air was 24, and still is, a stark reminder of how deadly pre-safety era American cars could be in real-world accidents. Number 22. 1959 Cadillac Series 62. The 1959 Cadillac Series 62 embodied the late 50s obsession with spectacle, wearing the tallest tail fins ever fitted to a production Cadillac and more chrome than some diners. It was glorious to behold, but nearly every one of those styling choices arrived before any serious conversation about occupant or pedestrian safety. Like its General Motors siblings, it rode on the so-called X-frame, a design that favored low profiles and quiet rides over crash protection. What you gained in boulevard swagger, you lost in survivability. The X-frame eliminated perimeter rails along the rocker panels, which meant side impacts had far less structure to resist intrusion. In a T-bone collision, forces could drive deep into the passenger compartment, a problem made worse by the Cadillac's significant mass and long doors. Inside, a rigid, non-collapsible steering column pointed straight at the driver, while a metal dashboard and hard switchgear waited to meet unrestrained occupants. Seatbelts were optional and rarely specified, so ejection and secondary impacts were tragically common in serious crashes. Those majestic fins created hazards of their own. The sharply creased chrome edges and bullet-style tail lamps concentrated forces in low-speed contact, turning parking lot nudges or close-quarter scrapes into laceration or puncture risks for pedestrians and cyclists. In multi-vehicle collisions, the protruding fin tips could ride up and over shorter cars, focusing impact loads where modern designs diffused them. Rearward visibility was compromised by the high fins and narrow backlight, making lane changes and reversing more precarious in crowded urban traffic. Dynamically, the Series 62 was tuned for float, not evasive control. All-drum brakes were fade-prone on long descents or repeated stops, lengthening braking distances just when you needed them shortest. Over-assisted power steering and a softly sprung, heaving ride could delay driver inputs and invite understeer, especially on bias-ply tires with limited wet grip. Ask it for a sudden lane change, and the big Cadillac might answer with wallow, tire, howl, and not enough road left to recover. Modern testing has shown that many late 50s full-size cars provide shockingly little occupant survival space in severe crashes, and the 1959 Cadillac shares the same structural liabilities. There were no crumple zones, no energy-absorbing columns, and no mandated restraints until well into the 1960s, with collapsible columns only appearing around 1967. So, while the Series 62 remains a rolling icon at shows and parades, its combination of X-frame construction, rigid interior hardware, fin-induced risks, and marginal braking makes it one of the deadliest expressions of America's style-first era. Admire it from a distance, because in period traffic, the price of glamour could be paid in blood. Number 21. 1960 Chevrolet Corvair. From its debut in 1960, the first-generation Corvair asked ordinary drivers to manage truly unconventional dynamics, and that mismatch proved deadly. Its rear-mounted flat six placed most of the weight over the swing axle rear suspension, a layout that generated abrupt oversteer when pushed or when tire pressures were set incorrectly. Chevrolet specified much lower pressure up front than in the rear, but many owners and service stations leveled them off out of habit, unknowingly priming the car for dangerous breakaway behavior. Under hard cornering or sudden avoidance maneuvers, the swing axles could jack, tucking a rear wheel under the car and snapping it into a spin that drivers struggled to catch. Rollovers and severe side impacts were a grim consequence when that snap came on public roads instead of test tracks. Compounding the problem was the absence of a standard front anti-roll bar on early models, which might have tempered weight transfer and camber change. In everyday terms, the Corvair asked novice drivers to respect racing car limits without giving them racing car feedback or safety margins. Steering that felt light until it wasn't, skinny bias-ply tires with modest grip, and single-circuit drum brakes that faded under heat turned a small mistake into a catastrophe all too quickly. The turbocharged Spider variants only raised the stakes, adding power without fundamentally addressing the rear suspension's geometry in these years. By the time Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed landed in 1965, lawsuits and crash reports had already painted a dire portrait. High-profile incidents, including the fatal 1962 wreck of comedian Ernie Kovacs, amplified the car's reputation for treachery when conditions turned sharp or slick. Owners frequently reported spins during simple lane changes, and rural two-lane roads, with gravel shoulders and sudden drop-offs, became unforgiving arenas for the Corvair's snap oversteer. Even minor maintenance lapses, like uneven tire inflation or worn shocks, could tip the balance from quirky to lethal. Chevrolet's 1964 update added a transverse rear leaf spring and a front anti-roll bar that substantially calmed the chassis. But for the 1960 through 1963 cars, the damage to metal and to human bodies was already done. In the context of America's safety awakening, the early Corvair stands as a cautionary tale about innovation launched without adequate safeguards or consumer education. It was clever, compact, and courageous in concept, yet in the hands of ordinary families, it too often became one of the deadliest American cars of its era. Number 20. 1964 Ford Mustang. When the Mustang arrived in the spring of 1964, it sold a dream of freedom, speed, and style to hundreds of thousands of new drivers who had never owned a sporty car before. What it did not sell was modern crash protection, because beneath the long hood and short deck was a structure and fuel system that turned routine rear impacts into potential fire tragedies. The signature flaw was the drop-in fuel tank that doubled as the trunk floor, separated from the passenger compartment by little more than thin sheet metal and trim. In a rear-end collision, deformation of the tail panel or filler neck could rupture the tank, allowing gasoline to pour forward through vents and seams directly into the cabin. All it took after that was a spark from compromised wiring or hot metal, and survivable crashes became fatal burn incidents. The problem was amplified by the era's lax restraints and interior design. Lap belts were often absent or unused before the new federal safety standards phased in around 1968, and early cars carried rigid steering columns, hard metal dashboards, and sharp interior hardware. In rear impacts, unbelted occupants could be thrown backward as fuel entered the space, compounding the danger and making egress slower just when seconds mattered most. Convertibles were no refuge either, because the open body offered no additional barrier to flames and little structural resistance to intrusion. Owners and first responders alike reported post-impact fires that moved with terrifying speed, overwhelming otherwise minor crash scenes. Real-world experience eventually forced incremental changes, but the core design persisted throughout the first generation. Dealers and aftermarket suppliers pushed trunk seals, shields, and improved filler necks, while later late 60s cars benefited from collapsible columns and mandated belts, yet the tank-as-floor architecture still left a critical vulnerability behind the rear axle. Complicating matters, the Mustang's everyman performance image encouraged spirited driving by novices, and drum brakes on many models faded quickly after repeated stops, lengthening distances in emergencies. Combine that with narrow bias-ply tires and soft suspension tuning, and avoiding a crash could be as challenging as surviving one. By the close of 1970, the first-generation Mustang stood as both a cultural landmark and a sobering safety case study. It proved that a wildly successful design could still hide a lethal compromise, and that the cost of packaging convenience and style behind the rear axle might be paid in lives. Beloved as it remains, the early Mustang earns its place here for turning ordinary rear-end collisions into extraordinary catastrophes. Number 19. 1965 Shelby Cobra 427. When Carroll Shelby unveiled the big block Cobra in 1965, he essentially sold a racing car with license plates. The 427 cubic inch Ford V8 delivered ferocious torque in a chassis that weighed little more than a ton. In period tune, the car could outrun almost anything on the road, yet it arrived with virtually none of the safety features drivers now take for granted. Between 1965 and 1967, the Cobra 427 earned a reputation as thrilling, unforgiving, and all too often fatal in untrained hands. The short wheelbase and immense torque meant throttle inputs were effectively steering commands, especially on narrow bias-ply tires. Lift abruptly mid-corner and the rear would come around with startling speed, a classic recipe for snap, oversteer, and roadside impacts. Although the big block cars used four-wheel disc brakes, repeated high-speed stops could still induce fade and lengthen stopping distances when it mattered most. Over-assisted nothing, under-assisted everything, the Cobra demanded strong arms, fine throttle control, and a racer's anticipation to keep it pointed straight. Many owners learned the hard way that a car capable of a sub-5-second sprint could also put you backwards into a tree before you could react. Safety equipment was rudimentary at best, typically a lap belt, a thin wood rim wheel, and a single-roll hoop behind the driver. There were no airbags, no head restraints, no door beams, and in many cars, not even shoulder belts to keep occupants anchored during violent rotations. The open cockpit invited ejection in rollovers, while the low doors and simple latches offered little resistance to being flung open in a crash. Side exit exhaust could burn occupants during hurried egress, complicating escape from fires that sometimes followed fuel line ruptures or carburetor backfires. Night driving added risk as primitive lighting and wiper performance encouraged overdriving the available visibility in a car that punished misjudgment instantly. The semi-competition variants blurred any remaining line between track and street, selling barely tamed race hardware to enthusiastic novices. In that 1965 to 1967 window, more than a few cars were written off within weeks of delivery, feeding the Cobra's fearsome mystique. Today, the 427 remains a legend, but its legend includes the clear lesson that raw power without protection exacts a heavy price. Respect it at the limit, or it will write the last line of your story for you. Number 18. 1965 Chevrolet Impala. The full-size Chevrolet Impala of 1965 and 1966 sold elegance and quiet speed, but it arrived before modern crash protection became a design priority. Under its handsome sheet metal sat a structure and cockpit that could turn routine collisions into life-threatening events, especially in the popular pillarless hardtop body style. Seatbelts were inconsistent in fit and use, head restraints were absent, and the steering column was a rigid spear pointed squarely at the driver. A metal dashboard, hard switchgear, and broad, unyielding surfaces completed an interior that punished unrestrained occupants in even moderate impacts. Chevrolet had moved to a perimeter frame for 1965, which improved stiffness versus the earlier X-frame, but the hardtop's missing B-pillars left the roof and side structure vulnerable. In rollovers, thin roof bows could deform or collapse, and in side impacts, the long, heavy doors invited deep intrusion into the occupant space. Door latches of the period were not engineered to modern standards, so pop-opens and partial ejections were distressingly common when cars were struck at angles. Tempered side glass shattered into the cabin, and without shoulder belts, many passengers met the windshield header or were thrown across the bench seat. Braking and handling further stacked the deck. All drum systems were standard and prone to fade after a few hard stops, particularly when laden with family and luggage on summer highways. Bias-ply tires offered limited wet grip, and slow, over-assisted steering made abrupt avoidance maneuvers clumsy in real traffic. A heavy nose, soft springs, and generous body roll could stretch stopping distances and widen arcs just when inches mattered, turning near misses into collisions. When impacts did occur, the single-circuit brake hydraulics, typical of the time, meant a line failure could yield total loss of braking with no backup. Context is critical to the Impala's deadliest reputation. These cars predated energy-absorbing steering columns that arrived widely in 1967 and the broader federal safety standards that took effect in 1968. Thus, the 1965 and 1966 Impalas combined generous speed and mass with minimal occupant restraint, brittle interior architecture, and a roof and door system ill-equipped for rollovers or side hits. Beloved today for their style and smoothness, they remain a stark reminder that beauty without protection can be fatal, especially when a pillarless silhouette and a rigid steering shaft meet real-world physics. Number 17. 1970 Dodge Charger RT. The Charger RT of 1970 was the poster child for late, muscle-era bravado, delivering outsized speed in a package whose margins for error were perilously thin. Standard power was the 440 Magnum, with the 426 Hemi optional, and either engine could propel the heavy body far beyond what its street chassis comfortably managed. Weight bias favored the nose and the torsion bar front with leaf spring rear-delivered float and axle tramp rather than composure when the pavement rippled or the brakes were stood on. Most cars left the factory with drum brakes at all four corners, and even those optioned with front discs could suffer dramatic fade after a few hard stops. On narrow bias-ply tires with modest tread, the RT's tidal wave of torque could overwhelm grip instantly, turning a small throttle mistake into a broadside slide across lanes. Steering was slow and over-assisted, so big inputs were required, just as body roll and weight transfer stretched arcs wider than drivers expected in emergencies. Road testers of the day praised the straight-line thunder while cautioning about wandering under braking, rear hop on broken surfaces, and how quickly the chassis protested on tight roads. Structural safety, though improved since the mid-1960s with energy-absorbing columns, still lacked crumple management and meaningful side impact reinforcement to keep intrusion out of the cabin. Lap belts were present and separate shoulder belts were appearing, but usage was inconsistent, and seat frames and anchorages could allow slack or submarining in severe impacts. The pillarless hardtop roof with thin bows was vulnerable in rollovers, while tempered side glass shattered into the cabin, inviting partial ejection of unrestrained occupants. The long rear overhang and underslung fuel tank sat in harm's way during high-speed rear impacts, where punctures could atomize fuel near hot exhausts and stray sparks. Add the era's burgeoning street racing culture and the Charger RT's cinematic image, and too many met immovable objects at unlawful velocities on public roads. Police crash narratives from the period are filled with single-vehicle loss of control, downhill brake fade, and trees or bridge abutments serving as the terminal stop. What renders the 1970 RT one of the deadliest is not a single notorious defect, but the convergence of staggering acceleration, marginal stopping, indifferent cornering, and modest occupant protection. Its legend remains secure at shows and on screens, yet in period traffic, the combination of mass, speed, and scant safety margins made ordinary mistakes irreversible. Number 16. 1971 Ford Pinto. The Ford Pinto promised thrifty transportation for the new subcompact era, but its packaging shortcut behind the rear axle made ordinary crashes terrifyingly lethal. Engineers located a thin, drop-in fuel tank just inches behind the differential and ahead of a light rear bumper, with sharp bolts and bracketry positioned like can openers in a rear impact. At urban speeds that many drivers would survive in sturdier cars, deformation of the tail panel and filler neck could tear the tank, atomizing gasoline into the trunk and passenger compartment. One spark from a braided wiring, a hot exhaust, or a collapsing lamp socket could turn a fender bender into a flash fire within seconds. Early crash investigations documented ruptures at impact velocities common to city traffic, showing how little reserve the Pinto's structure provided once the rear apron buckled. Unlike vehicles with reinforced barriers or protected tank locations, the Pinto offered no robust shield between the fuel cell and the crushing geometry of the axle and bolts. Owners, police, and first responders described scenes where otherwise survivable injuries were eclipsed by rapid post-impact fire growth that trapped occupants before belts could be released or doors unlatched. Convertible-like interior trim and thin quarter structures allowed flame and vapors to move forward quickly, further shortening escape time. The controversy deepened when internal analyses surfaced suggesting inexpensive countermeasures, simple shields, relocating hardware, stronger fillers might have mitigated the hazard at minimal per-car cost. Instead, the basic tank placement persisted throughout the core production run, and lawsuits in the late 1970s, including the landmark Grimshaw case in 1978, crystallized public awareness of the design's fatal consequences. Ford ultimately implemented changes and issued service campaigns, but only after years in which rear-end fires had become the Pinto's tragic signature. Compounding the profile were rollaway and unintended movement allegations tied to certain Ford automatic transmissions of the period, which in driveway or parking scenarios could convert a minor miscue into a severe injury event. While those transmission claims spanned multiple nameplates, the Pinto's reputation meant such incidents were often folded into its broader safety narrative. And beyond defects, the car's narrow track, modest tires, and drum brake fade left little margin for avoiding trouble once a situation began to unravel. Historians place the Pinto near the top of any roster of deadly American cars because it combined a fragile rear structure, a poorly protected fuel tank, and a long paper trail of fires that transformed low-energy collisions into fatal catastrophes. It stands today as a sobering case study in how a small packaging decision and the delay in correcting it can cost lives on real roads at real, everyday speeds. Number 15. 1971 Chevrolet Vega. Chevrolet pitched the Vega as the modern American answer to small, efficient motoring, but its engineering shortcuts turned everyday driving into a gamble. The lightweight unibody and narrow track promised agility, yet in real traffic, the car's modest tires, soft suspension, and drum brake fade left little margin when a quick stop or swerve was needed. Early cars were especially unforgiving in emergency maneuvers, where weight transfer and body roll could overwhelm front grip and widen arcs into adjacent lanes. Add the mismatch of tiny subcompacts sharing roads with full-size sedans, and occupants bore the brunt when collisions happened. The Vega's most alarming defect was not how it drove, but how it could catastrophically fail. Rear axle components on early production runs were prone to separation under load, a failure mode that could let a wheel depart its speed and send the car spinning without warning. Period safety actions brought hundreds of thousands of cars back to dealers for fixes, but only after incidents had laid bare how a single weak part could cascade into a loss of control. For drivers, the difference between an uneventful commute and a roadside wreck sometimes came down to whether those parts had been replaced in time. Under the hood, the novel high-silicon aluminum engine was meant to save weight and fuel, yet chronic overheating, head gasket woes, and oil consumption plagued early years. A power plant that seizes or stumbles in traffic turns the car behind you into a projectile, and stall-outs at intersections or on freeway ramps led to all the wrong kinds of close calls. Meanwhile, rapid corrosion, front fenders, rocker panels, and door bottoms could undermine door alignment and latch integrity, precisely the pieces you need to stay closed and square when a crash loads the shell. Thin inner door structures and the absence of robust side impact beams left little to arrest intrusion from a T-bone hit. Rear impact protection was also meager, with a light tail structure and hardware around the tank that critics argued could become puncture points in severe hits. Even when fire did not result, the combination of lightweight structure, minimal crush management, and sparse restraints turned moderate collisions into serious injury events. By the mid-1970s, Chevrolet had implemented improvements, but the damage to the Vega's safety reputation was done. In the pantheon of deadly American cars, the Vega earns its place not for a single notorious scandal, but for a pattern of failures. Axle separations, structural fragility, braking and handling limits that too often turned routine mishaps into traumatic, sometimes fatal outcomes. Number 14. 1955 Jeep CJ5. Born from wartime lineage, the Jeep CJ5 was designed for trails, fields, and fire roads, not multi-lane highways filled with full-size sedans and trucks. Its 81-inch wheelbase, narrow track, and high center of gravity made it wonderfully maneuverable off-road but fundamentally twitchy on pavement. Owners loved its go-anywhere image, yet the same traits that let it clamber over rocks could turn a simple swerve at city speeds into a rollover. As America paved more miles in the 1960s and 1970s, the CJ5's shortcomings transitioned from inconvenience to life-threatening risk. On-road dynamics were stacked against the driver from the start. Solid axles and soft leaf springs delivered ample articulation off-road, but in emergency maneuvers, they produced abrupt weight transfer and dramatic body roll. Early models relied on drum brakes at all four corners, which faded quickly after repeated stops and lengthened distances just when precision mattered most. Knobby all-terrain tires that excelled in mud and gravel offered limited lateral grip on wet asphalt, so a quick lane change could overload the outside tires and start the tip-up sequence. Short wheelbase vehicles recover quickly when set up correctly, but when combined with a tall stance and narrow track, corrections often arrive too late. By the late 1970s and around 1980, investigative tests and televised demonstrations highlighted how easily a CJ5 could flop in an avoidance maneuver that other vehicles managed. Crash data showed a disproportionately high rate of single-vehicle rollovers compared with conventional passenger cars, especially during abrupt steering inputs on dry pavement. Even modest speeds, 40 to 50 miles per hour, could be enough to initiate a trip over when a tire caught a curb or soft shoulder. Load it with passengers, cargo, or a top and doors, and the raised center of gravity only made matters worse. Occupant protection was minimal throughout much of the production run. Early CJ5s often lacked roll bars, and belts, when present, were typically lap-only and frequently unused. Canvas doors, or no doors at all, meant ejection was common once a rollover began, and the fold-down windshield provided little resistance to intrusion. In the earliest years, some models carried the fuel tank beneath the driver's seat, adding the specter of leakage or fire in certain impacts. Later additions like sport bars and front disc brakes helped, but they could not rewrite the vehicle's physics. What makes the CJ5 earn a place among the deadliest is not a single scandal, but the convergence of geometry, hardware, and use case. A short, narrow, tall, open-top 4x4 built for trails wound up sharing fast suburban arteries with heavy traffic, and ordinary corrections at 60 miles per hour could escalate into unrecoverable rollovers in seconds. Beloved for its authenticity, the CJ5 remains a legend, but on public roads, its design left perilously little margin between adventure and tragedy. Number 13. 1976 Chevrolet Chevette. Chevrolet sold the Chevette as basic, honest transportation for an America grappling with fuel shocks and shrinking budgets. It delivered thrift, but that bargain came with a safety bill few buyers saw coming. The tiny footprint, narrow track, and light curb weight meant short crush zones and little mass to share forces in multi-car impacts. In collisions with the full-size sedans and pickups that dominated the roads of the late 1970s, occupants frequently absorbed the load that structure should have managed. The body shell provided minimal side intrusion resistance by modern standards, with thin inner door assemblies and modest reinforcements in the sills. A T-bone hit could drive metal deep into the cabin before energy had anywhere to go, especially in the two-door, where long doors became leverage arms. Front crush structure was limited, so offset head-on crashes often pushed steering gear and pedals toward the occupant space even when speeds were moderate. Seatbelts existed, but rear positions were commonly lap-only and rear head restraints were absent, elevating whiplash and ejection risks for backseat riders. On the road, the Chevette's dynamics left little room for error. A softly sprung chassis and light rear end could get skittish under trail braking or mid-corner bumps, particularly in rain-slick conditions. Rear drums faded quickly after repeated stops, stretching braking distances just when a second chance was needed. Slow steering ratios demanded big inputs, yet the car's narrow tires offered little lateral reserve once the limit arrived, turning avoidance maneuvers into spins that unfolded faster than most drivers could correct. Age made things worse. Rapid corrosion on rockers, fender arches, and door bottoms wasn't just cosmetic. It could compromise latch alignment and reduce the structure's ability to stay square in a crash. Fleet duty and student driver use increased exposure, putting many Chevettes into exactly the high-risk scenarios: night driving, two-lane passing, crowded arterials, where a small car with sparse protection is most vulnerable. Period insurance and highway data consistently showed elevated fatality rates for the smallest class of cars relative to larger vehicles during the late 1970s and early 1980s, and the Chevette was squarely in that crosshairs. None of this made the Chevette malicious. It was simply engineered to a price in an era before robust small car safety was common. But the combination of minimal side protection, short crush space, brake and tire limitations, and widespread use by inexperienced drivers turned ordinary mistakes into serious injuries far too often. That is why the Chevrolet Chevette, despite its thrift and ubiquity, earns a place among the deadliest American cars ever built. Number 12. 1978 Chevrolet Malibu. Downsized for the late 1970s, the Chevrolet Malibu and its G-body siblings promised modern efficiency without sacrificing big car comfort. They became everywhere cars, family sedans, fleet specials, and even police units, logging huge miles on suburban arterials and interstates. Hidden in that ubiquity was a defect that could turn a routine commute into a catastrophe. On many cars built between 1978 and 1981, a critical fastener in the steering linkage or intermediate shaft could loosen or go missing, allowing the column-to-gear connection to separate under load. When separation occurred, the steering wheel would suddenly free spin with no effect, and the front wheels chose their own path. Owners and technicians described warning signs that were easy to dismiss: an intermittent clunk, vague on-center feel, or momentary binding during parking maneuvers. Then, often during a sharp turn from a stop or a quick lane change at speed, the last threads let go. In an instant, the driver had no directional control, a scenario far more unforgiving than brake fade or engine stall. A heavy nose, rear drive weight transfer, and soft bushings could send the car drifting wide or darting unpredictably as caster and toe changed without command. On two-lane roads, the outcome could be a head-on, while in town, it meant curbs, poles, or cross-traffic. General Motors ultimately issued sweeping safety actions to inspect the coupling, verify the presence and torque of the pinch bolt, and install revised hardware or a retention strap where required. Dealers were instructed to correct column alignment, replace worn rag joints, and ensure the intermediate shaft could not telescope free when the chassis flexed. Those fixes worked when they were performed, but millions of cars were already in service, and not every owner or fleet returned promptly. Meanwhile, premature wear in front-end components like idler arms and center links added slop that masked developing trouble until the moment of failure. Stopping these cars was better than earlier eras, with front disc common yet repeated hard use still brought longer distances and pull in the wet. Combine that with bias ply or early radial tires of modest grip and a pillarless hardtop option on some trims, and survivability after a crash was hardly assured. What earns the 1978 to 1981 Malibu and its G-body peers a place among the deadliest is the nature of the failure itself. A single loosened fastener could erase steering while the vehicle was already committed to a turn, leaving drivers with no mechanical path to recovery and only luck between them and tragedy. Number 11. 1974 Bricklin SV1. The Bricklin SV1 promised a future where safety and style were the same thing, with integrated roll protection, impact-absorbing bumpers, and dramatic gull-wing doors. Conceived by Malcolm Bricklin and assembled in New Brunswick, it wore acrylic skins bonded to fiberglass over a steel perimeter frame, aiming to shrug off dents and resist corrosion better than Detroit sheet metal. The marketing line was bold for the era, a sports car that protected its occupants rather than sacrificing them at the altar of speed and fashion. In practice, the engineering compromises and rushed production turned that promise into a new category of risk. The signature gull-wing doors used electro-hydraulic actuators that were heavy, complex, and alarmingly failure-prone in daily use. Owners reported doors that would not open, would not stay up, or moved with glacial speed, a nuisance in fair weather and a trap when seconds mattered after an impact. If electrical power or pump pressure dropped in a crash, the doors could remain sealed, and the small sliding windows made escape difficult for anyone larger than a child. In rollovers or side impacts, misaligned latches and warped apertures further increased the likelihood of entrapment just when fire or fuel leaks were most dangerous. Quality control was equally grim, compounding safety shortcomings with breakdown risk in traffic. The acrylic body panels were susceptible to cracking and UV crazing, and panel gaps could foul door mechanisms or expose sharp edges at precisely occupant contact height. Early cars suffered from stalling, vapor lock, lighting gremlins, and brake hardware inconsistencies that lengthened stopping distances and undermined confidence in emergency maneuvers. Suspension tuning favored show car stance over transient control, so abrupt lane changes produced wallow and delayed responses on narrow bias ply or early radial tires. The result was a car that not only increased the odds of a crash, but also raised the stakes if one occurred. Ironically, the SV1 met bumper mandates and touted built-in roll structure while overlooking basic egress and durability fundamentals. Production barely spanned 1974 and 1975 before the venture collapsed, leaving owners with a safety car that required workarounds like manual door releases and aftermarket fixes to be tolerable. Collectors today retrofit improved actuators and seals, tacitly acknowledging the original system's hazards. The Bricklin's lesson is stark and enduring. A safety narrative without robust execution can be deadlier than an honest sports car because it lulls drivers into trusting hardware that fails when the world turns sideways. For those reasons, the Bricklin SV1 earns its place among the deadliest American cars of its decade. Number 10. 1981 DeLorean DMC-12. The DeLorean DMC-12 arrived as a stainless steel icon, yet behind the movie stardom was a road car with safety compromises that could turn a minor crash into a life-threatening scenario. Its gull-wing doors, unlike the electrically actuated panels of some contemporaries, relied on torsion bars and struts that worked well when everything was aligned, but even modest structure deformation could jam a hinge or latch. If the car came to rest on its roof or against a barrier that trapped a door, the small toll booth side windows offered only a narrow slot for escape, effectively limiting self-rescue and complicating first responder access. Emergency personnel unfamiliar with the unconventional latches sometimes spent precious seconds figuring out how to open a door that looked like a hatch but behaved like a heavy canopy. Beneath the brushed panels sat a fiberglass underbody bonded to a steel backbone, a layout that provided decent torsional stiffness for its day but lacked the engineered crumple management that later sports cars adopted. There were no airbags, no active restraints, and no electronic stability aids, so survivability leaned on belts alone and on how squarely an impact struck the structure. Aging concerns also mattered. Corrosion of the underlying frame on poorly stored cars could weaken mounting points, so a hit that a healthy chassis might tolerate could deform or shear compromised sections. In secondary collisions, sharp alignment shifts could pinch door seals or tweak hinges just enough to seize those signature wings shut. Dynamics brought their own traps. The rear engine layout concentrated mass behind the driver, and while outright power was modest, Liftoff mid-corner could induce snap oversteer that surprised owners expecting benign grand touring manners. Staggered tires and four-wheel discs provided grip and braking on paper, yet in wet conditions, the combination of rear weight bias, quick transient responses, and no stability control demanded disciplined inputs. Fuel injection quirks on poorly tuned examples could cause hesitation or stalling at intersections, inviting rear-end impacts in exactly the scenarios where the door's operability mattered most. At night or in bad weather, limited rearward visibility and low seating height made judging closing speeds harder among taller trucks and sedans. The result was a car that could both increase the likelihood of certain crashes and raise the stakes when they occurred. Collectors today retrofit improved struts, maintain frame coatings, and carry glass break tools as a hedge against entrapment, tacit admission that the original package left narrow margins. The DeLorean DMC-12 remains a cultural legend, but judged by the criteria of escape, structural forgiveness, and predictable handling, it earns its place among the deadliest American cars of its era. Number 9. 1983 Ford Bronco II. Born from the Ranger pickup, the Ford Bronco II shrank the traditional sport utility formula into a short, narrow, tall package that excelled on trails but turned treacherous on pavement. Its short wheelbase, high center of gravity, and relatively narrow track created a chassis that changed attitude abruptly in emergency maneuvers, especially on dry asphalt where tires bit and then tripped. What felt nimble at neighborhood speeds could become nervous at highway pace, and a sudden lane change, ramp misjudgment, or split traction situation had a way of escalating into a yaw that drivers struggled to arrest. Suspension tuning and hardware choices compounded the risk. Twin traction beam front suspension and a leaf spring rear allowed generous wheel travel for rough ground, but on-road that travel translated into pronounced body roll and slow transient response. With rear drums prone to fade and modest tire footprints by modern standards, late braking into a downhill corner or a quick swerve around debris could overload the outside tires and tip the balance the wrong way. Once the vehicle's roll angle crossed a certain threshold, recovery space vanished quickly, and curb strikes or soft shoulders acted like trip points that finished the rollover. The human factors were equally unforgiving. These were family SUVs, often loaded with passengers, cargo, and roof racks that pushed the center of gravity even higher. Seatbelt use in the mid to late 1980s lagged today's norms, so partial ejections were distressingly common once glass shattered and doors popped under torsion. Roof strength reflected the standards of its time, not the rollover-specific criteria that would come later, meaning roof crush and inverted landings could produce catastrophic head and neck injuries. Owners who fitted taller tires or suspension lifts for appearance further narrowed the margin, sometimes without upgrading shocks, sway control, or brakes to match. Crash narratives from the era show a pattern that is hard to ignore. Single vehicle rollovers after abrupt steering inputs on ramps, loss of control following a rear-wheel drop onto a gravel shoulder, and multi-vehicle pileups that began as overcorrections all recur with grim regularity. Safety advocates and investigators repeatedly flagged the Bronco II's propensity to overturn compared with conventional passenger cars and even many contemporary SUVs, and litigation in the late 1980s dragged internal stability deliberations into the spotlight. While careful drivers could operate a Bronco II for years without incident, the combination of geometry, tuning, and real-world usage meant that ordinary mistakes too often had extraordinary consequences. That is why the Bronco II, despite its compact charm and off-road credibility, earns a firm place among the deadliest American vehicles of its decade. Number 8. 1984 Pontiac Fiero. Pontiac sold the Fiero as a bold American first, an affordable, mid-engine commuter that looked like an exotic but sipped fuel on the daily grind. It was clever packaging: space frame, steel skeleton, sheet-molded composite body panels, and a thrifty four-cylinder that kept insurance and pump bills low. But the same tight engine bay, light mass, and cost-cut compromises that made the concept viable also set the stage for some of the era's most alarming real-world safety failures. Early cars with the 2.5-liter Iron Duke carried an oil capacity and cooling margin so slim that sustained heat or neglect could tip them into trouble fast. Low oil levels led to bearing distress and connecting rod failures that could punch through the block, spraying hot oil onto glowing exhaust components. The result, far too often, was a sudden engine bay fire that started as a small flare and became an overwhelming blaze in seconds. Composite outer panels did not ignite like dry tinder, but they softened, deformed, and dropped, complicating egress and feeding the fire with dripping plastics and exposed adhesives. Service campaigns in the mid-1980s added revised dipsticks, shields, and component updates, but the damage to the car's safety reputation had already been done. The Fiero's dynamics could also ambush the unwary. To save money, Pontiac repurposed a front-drive sedan's front suspension for use at the rear, a compromise that bred bump steer and twitchiness in abrupt maneuvers. On narrow tires and with modest brake hardware, a panic swerve or downhill stop could stretch stopping distances and pull the car off its intended line. Only in the final model year of 1988 did a clean sheet suspension arrive, by which time sales were collapsing under the weight of headline fires and owner anxiety. Occupant protection reflected its era, not modern expectations. There were no airbags, side impact beams were modest, and seatbelt usage in the mid-1980s lagged today's norms. If a fire followed even a minor impact, heat-warped panels and jammed latches could slow escape, while the low seating position made clambering out under smoke more difficult. Worse, the Fiero's small footprint and light weight meant mismatched collisions with full-size sedans and trucks transferred energy straight to bodies, not structure. Enthusiasts remember the Fiero as an innovative American mid-engine pioneer, and properly maintained later cars can be rewarding. But judged by the criteria of deadly design, propensity for engine bay fires, edgy emergency handling on early suspensions, and thin crash protection, the 1984 to 1988 Fiero earns its place on this list. It was a smart idea, delivered with too little margin for error when everything went wrong. Number 7. 1984 Dodge Caravan. When Chrysler launched the modern minivan in the mid-1980s, the Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager rewrote family transportation with low floors, sliding doors, and 3 rows of seats. They were everywhere in suburbia: school runs, grocery lots, church parking, and that ubiquity meant their safety shortcomings had consequences on a national scale. Foremost among them was a rear liftgate latch that could pop open in moderate crashes, turning a survivable fender bender into a lethal ejection event. Early vans relied on a liftgate latch design that did not reliably stay engaged when the body shell twisted under impact loads. In a rear or oblique hit, the quarter structure and hatch could deform enough to let the latch disengage, spring the door, and create a wide opening at the back of the cabin. Because third-row occupants were often children, and because belts were inconsistently used in the era, unrestrained passengers could be thrown out as the van spun or rebounded. Even properly belted riders faced a rising risk if the bench mount shifted or if cargo surged forward once the hatch released. The interior architecture of those years did the vans no favors. Many positions were lap belt only, head restraints were limited, and there were no airbags in the early model years. Side impact structure was modest by later standards, so intrusions from a T-bone could distort the rear aperture and compromise latch alignment just when containment mattered most. Real-world crashes frequently combine these factors: an intersection impact, a sprung hatch, scattered cargo, and delayed egress through a jammed sliding door on the traffic side. By the mid-1990s, Mounting investigations and lawsuits pushed Chrysler into a sweeping action to retrofit stronger liftgate latches on millions of vans built from the early years through the early 1990s. Company statements acknowledged at least 24 fatalities linked to rear door openings, and safety agencies tallied many more injuries where ejection or partial ejection changed outcomes from serious to catastrophic. Families described collisions that should have ended with minor injuries, but instead became tragedies the moment the hatch unlatched. What cements these first-wave minivans among the deadliest is not high speed or exotic hardware, but a single weak point that defeated the most basic safety function, keeping people inside the vehicle during a crash. When a rear door becomes an escape route in an impact, every other protection is undermined. The Dodge Caravan and Plymouth Voyager of 1984 to 1994 remain icons for inventing the segment, but their early liftgate latch design stands as a stark lesson in how a small piece of hardware can tip a crash from survivable to fatal. Number 6. 1990 Ford Explorer. When the Ford Explorer debuted in the early 1990s, it turned the truck-based sport utility from niche tool into America's family default. Underneath the friendly bodywork, however, lived a Ranger-derived ladder frame, tall ride height, and a center of gravity that left little margin in abrupt maneuvers. The formula worked brilliantly for marketing, but proved treacherous when the unexpected happened on real roads at real speeds. The deadliest chapter came with factory-fit Firestone all-terrain tires and a low recommended inflation pressure, around 26 pounds per square inch, to soften the ride and tame head toss. Under heat, load, or highway speeds, tread separations could occur, and when a rear tire shed its tread, the tall, narrow Explorer was primed to yaw and then trip into a rollover. Crash files from the late 1990s told a repeating story of freeway blowouts, sudden swerves, and violent overturns that turned otherwise survivable incidents into fatal events. Analyses from the era highlighted sharply elevated rollover fatality rates versus many peers, and the combination of tire failures and top-heavy dynamics cemented the model's reputation for lethal outcomes. A massive tire recall in the year 2000 followed, but by then the damage to vehicles and families was done. Structural and restraint realities of the period compounded the risk. Roof strength targets predated later rollover-specific standards, so severe crush and inverted landings could intrude into the occupant space. Side glass and door latches of the time were vulnerable to opening under torsion, and with belt use lagging late-model norms, partial ejections were distressingly common. Electronic stability control was not yet widespread in the 1990s, leaving drivers to manage sudden rear tire events with nothing more than steering, feel, and luck. Load an Explorer with passengers, cargo, or a roof rack, and the center of gravity climbed higher still, further narrowing the window between a save and a rollover. Ford and suppliers rolled out countermeasures, replacement tires, revised inflation guidance, suspension and tire updates, and later geometry tweaks, but reputations forged in headlines are hard to erase. What ultimately earns the 1990 to 2004 Explorer its place among the deadliest is not a single quirk, but a cascade. A high-centered, body-on-frame SUV paired with vulnerable tires and no electronic safety net, meeting everyday hazards at highway speed. For millions, it was the face of the sport utility boom, yet its most infamous failures showed how quickly family convenience could become catastrophe. Number 5. 1992 Dodge Viper. The Dodge Viper arrived as a back-to-basics brute, a road-legal hot rod that traded creature comforts and electronic safety nets for raw speed and sensation. From the first RT/10 in 1992 through the GTS coupes of the late 1990s, it packed colossal V10 torque into a short wheelbase chassis with wide tires, stiff springs, and very little forgiveness. In an era when rivals were adopting anti-lock braking and traction aids, the Viper's philosophy remained analog, demanding race driver precision from owners who often lacked it. The result was a car that could thrill on a perfect day and punish a tiny mistake with catastrophic speed. Dynamics were the heart of the danger. Cold tires, paint stripes, or a dusty apex could turn a modest throttle squeeze into sudden oversteer, and a mid-corner lift would snap weight forward and send the tail around with shocking violence. Without traction control or stability control for the entire 1992 to 2002 span, recovery relied on lightning corrections in space most public roads do not offer. Early cars lacked anti-lock brakes entirely, and even when ABS arrived late in the second generation, around 2001, threshold braking still demanded finesse to avoid wheel lock and spins. High speeds came effortlessly, but so did flat-spotted tires, barrier kisses, and single-car impacts when ambition outpaced grip. The hardware amplified consequences once things went wrong. Side exit exhausts could burn legs during panicked egress, especially if the car had rotated and come to rest against an obstacle. Early RT/10s used soft side curtains and minimal weather gear that complicated visibility and escape, while cabin heat soak and heavy controls wore down drivers over long stints. There were no airbags at launch and no electronic roll mitigation, and door structures and restraint tuning reflected the standards of the 1990s rather than the more stringent expectations that followed. Track-style seating kept drivers planted when they got it right, but offered little comfort or mercy when they did not. Real-world attrition tells the story as clearly as any spec sheet. Insurance data and owner lore alike recount brand new cars written off within weeks, often in dry, daylight conditions where overconfidence met unforgiving physics. Experienced hands could make a Viper dance, yet average drivers met a machine that would not save them from themselves. That is why the 1992 to 2002 Dodge Viper, icon though it is, belongs on a list of the deadliest American cars, because its intoxicating power arrives with almost no safety margin when the world stops being perfect. Number 4. 1992 Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor. The Ford Crown Victoria Police Interceptor became the default American patrol car through the 1990s and the 2000s, prized for its durability, rear-wheel drive balance, and body-on-frame construction. Yet the very layout that made it easy to repair hid a deadly vulnerability in high-speed rear impacts, the exact crash police face while stopped on highway shoulders. Its fuel tank sat behind the rear axle with limited shielding, close to sharp suspension hardware and the differential, and just ahead of a long rear overhang that deforms first in a strike. When a fast-moving vehicle slammed into a parked cruiser, intrusion could puncture the tank, atomize fuel into the trunk and cabin, and ignite within seconds. Real-world crash narratives are chillingly consistent. A trooper completes a traffic stop, warning lights blazing, when a distracted driver veers onto the shoulder and hits the cruiser square from behind. The rear structure folds forward, hardware and brackets rip into the plastic tank, and cargo in the trunk. Spike strips, toolkits, metal organizers become shrapnel that can tear lines and vents. In many cases, doors jam, the cabin fills with smoke, and the partition between front seats and rear area delays escape, turning survivable blunt trauma into a fatal post-impact fire. Dozens of officers lost their lives in exactly this scenario over the platform's long service run, cementing the car's grim reputation among safety investigators. Early engineering defenses were modest, and for years agencies improvised with homemade shields and trunk packaging changes. By the mid-2000s, the manufacturer released police-only countermeasures, including a trunk pack to position equipment forward of the tank, bolt and bracket shields, heat barriers, and later an optional fire suppression system that discharged after a severe rear impact. These kits reduced risk but could not erase the physics of a large sedan absorbing a high-energy strike directly into its fuel reservoir. Even with improvements, officers working night shifts on fast interstates remained exposed to the worst case: a heavy hit that rapidly overwhelms structure, ruptures the cell, and feeds a fire before egress is possible. Compounding the problem, early model years predated widespread side airbags, and belt use patterns during roadside duties sometimes involved partial unbuckling to reach consoles and radios, slowing escape when every second mattered. Body-on-frame repairability helped departments keep fleets on the road, but it did not provide modern crumple management around the tank, and stiff ladder rails could transmit crash energy forward rather than dissipate it away from the reservoir. The result is a paradoxical icon, beloved by agencies for toughness and control, yet infamous for rear impact fire deaths unique to the way police must use their cars. For that deadly intersection of design and duty, the Crown Victoria Police Interceptor earns its place near the top of this list. Number 3. 1993 Jeep Grand Cherokee. The first two generations of the Jeep Grand Cherokee paired everyday family duty with a packaging decision that made rear crashes uniquely dangerous. A plastic fuel tank sat low and aft of the rear axle, tucked behind modest structure and ahead of a long liftgate overhang that crumpled first in a hit. In many real-world rear impacts, brackets, bolts, or intruding hardware could breach the tank or tear its fittings, releasing fuel into a confined space already riddled with hot surfaces and electrical sources. What should have been a survivable collision too often cascaded into a rapid post-impact fire measured in seconds, not minutes. The hazard did not depend on highway speeds alone. Urban crashes at moderate velocities could shove the rear structure forward, kink the filler neck, and shear vent lines, turning the cargo area into a pathway for fumes and flame. Door deformation and liftgate misalignment frequently jammed latches, trapping occupants as smoke filled the cabin. Families carried strollers, tools, and metal cargo systems in the trunk. And under crash loads, those items became battering rams that further damaged the fuel system. Unibody construction brought advantages in ride and weight, but it offered little sacrificial structure between the tank and a striking vehicle. Unlike designs that relocate the tank forward of the axle or surround it with robust crossmembers, these early Grand Cherokees left the cell exposed where intrusion vectors and sharp edges multiplied. Compounding the risk, many examples rolled without side airbags or electronic stability control for much of their production span, so loss of control secondary impacts could follow the initial hit. When fire did start, high interior plastics loads and a large liftgate opening encouraged fast flame spread and dense smoke, cutting escape time dramatically. Public pressure eventually brought a late remedy. In 2013, a large safety action added trailer hitches to many affected vehicles, with the hitch intended to act as a rear impact buffer. The measure helped in some scenarios but could not fully armor the tank against oblique strikes, underrides, or hardware punctures that originated above hitch height. Owners and first responders continued to document crashes where the sequence, rear hit, fuel release, rapid ignition, jammed doors, played out too quickly for effective rescue. What earns the 1993 to 2004 Grand Cherokee its place among the deadliest is this cruel chain reaction. A design that placed a plastic tank behind the axle with limited shielding turned ordinary rear-end collisions into catastrophic fires, and a late, partial fix could not rewrite the physics baked into the layout. For a vehicle trusted to carry families every day, that is an unforgivable margin. Number 2. 2002 to Jeep Liberty. Launched in the early 2000s as the spiritual heir to the Cherokee, the Jeep Liberty KJ blended honest 4x4 credentials with family-friendly marketing, but a critical packaging choice turned rear impacts into a uniquely deadly threat. Its plastic fuel tank sat low and behind the rear axle with only modest surrounding structure, placing the reservoir exactly where intruding hardware and deforming sheet metal converge in a collision. In real traffic, this meant that moderate urban shunts, not just highway strikes, could kink filler necks, shear vents, or puncture the cell, releasing fuel into a space crowded with hot surfaces and live wiring. What should have been a survivable rear-end crash too often cascaded into a rapid post-impact fire measured in seconds. The Liberty's tailgate and quarter structure complicated escape at the very moment time mattered most. Rear intrusion could twist the liftgate aperture and jam latches, while cargo, strollers, tool totes, metal organizers became battering rams that tore lines and fittings as the body folded. Doors frequently stuck after the hit, smoke moved forward through trim gaps, and unibody seams that were never intended to channel flame suddenly did exactly that. Passengers found themselves fighting both deformation and fire, with seconds shaved away by belts snagging on hardware and glass too small to serve as a clean exit. Safety fundamentals of the era further narrowed the margin. Early model years lacked modern rollover strength targets. Side curtain airbags were not universal, and electronic stability control was not yet standard, so secondary impacts or loss of control sequences could follow the initial strike. A roof rack, a cargo box, or simply a full complement of passengers pushed the center of gravity higher, increasing the likelihood that a spin or curb strike would end in a tip-over that accelerated fuel release. With relatively limited rear crash energy management, the Liberty depended on luck and alignment as much as structure. Public pressure eventually drove a broad safety action in 2013 that added trailer hitches to many affected Liberties. The hitch intended to act as a bumper-like buffer in certain rear impacts. The measure helped in some straight-on scenarios, but could not fully shield the tank in oblique strikes, underrides, or when puncture sources sat above hitch height. Owners and first responders continued to report sequences that read the same way: rear hit, fuel release, ignition, jammed doors, unfolding too fast for effective rescue. The Jeep Liberty KJ earns its place among the deadliest because a single design decision placed a vulnerable plastic tank in harm's way, then paired it with real-world conditions, cargo, children, city speeds that magnified the consequences. For a vehicle trusted for everyday family duty, that is a margin of error measured not in inches, but in lives. Number 1. 2005 Chevrolet Cobalt. The Chevrolet Cobalt looked like a straightforward small car for new drivers and commuters, but a tiny component inside its ignition switch turned everyday trips into fatal gambles. The detent spring and plunger that hold the key in the run position could require so little torque that a jolt from a pothole, a knee brushing the key, or a heavy keychain swing could rotate the switch toward accessory or off while the car was moving. In an instant, the engine died, power steering assist vanished, brake boost faded, and, most crucially, the airbags were disabled before the crash that often followed. What should have been a controllable swerve or routine stop became a no-assist, no-airbag emergency with brutal outcomes for occupants. Real-world sequences were tragically consistent. A driver hits a ripple on a highway, the key nudges rearward, and the steering suddenly goes heavy just as traffic compresses. The harder the driver fights the wheel, the more speed is lost without boost, lengthening, stopping distance, and setting up a rear end or run off. When the car finally strikes something, the airbags never fire because the system saw the switch out of run, turning a survivable impact into head strike trauma. Young drivers, overrepresented in the Cobalt's buyer base, were especially vulnerable to this cascade, and nighttime or wet conditions doubled the odds that a small mistake would escalate. Investigations later revealed that engineers had logged concerns about low switch torque and that a running change to the switch internals increased torque without changing part numbers, obscuring the trail. Families and safety agencies connected crashes across states and years, building a picture of a failure that did not require speed, recklessness, or weather, just bad luck and a bump. By the mid-2010s, a sweeping recall covered roughly 2.6 million vehicles, But by then, the toll included more than 100 confirmed deaths and many serious injuries linked to airbag non-deployment after ignition rollback. Independent analyses also found that 2005 to 2008 Cobalts posted among the highest driver fatality rates in their class, a statistic that fit the defects' grim mechanics. What cements the Cobalt's place among the deadliest American cars is how a dime-sized part could simultaneously remove 3 layers of protection: engine power, steering and brake assist, and airbags before impact. No exotic driving was required, only a key, a bump, and the wrong moment. For a generation of families, that combination turned a budget commuter into a case study in how small engineering choices can carry life and death consequences on ordinary roads.